voter ID really has three purposes in election administration. One, it interacts with the requirements under voter registration of both identity, am I who I say I am, and residence, am I properly tied to the jurisdiction in which I'm casting a ballot. The second, it's got a practical purpose. As America becomes more mobile, the person behind the table in a polling place doesn't necessarily know the person in front of the table. And so having an opportunity for that person to not just self-identify, but offer some proof of identity can be helpful. And then finally, and this is the area which has gotten the most attention, it's got some political or policy significance. It is, in many ways, right at the cutting edge between concerns about fraud and disenfranchisement, that it is an opportunity for a single voter at a single polling place in a single election, both to prove that she is who she says she is, but also to have the opportunity to cast a valid ballot. If you read the newspapers or the blogosphere or watch cable TV, you would think that the issue of voter ID, which is so fiercely debated right now, is a brand new issue and is somehow tied either to the last election or the next one. But the truth is, voter ID has been an issue for quite some time. Even before the 2000 presidential election, states were looking for ways to better identify voters within their jurisdictions. And in fact, a couple of states, Virginia being one of them, went back and forth with the federal government about whether or not requiring ID for their state's voters would somehow run afoul of the Voting Rights Act. And so while voter ID is very much with us today, it has been with us in some way for quite a while. Any jurisdiction which is considering imposing voter identification requirements really has to ask a series of questions. The first is, are they going to require ID at all? There are still states and localities across this country where either self-identification or a signature on the voter rolls is all the identification that's necessary to cast a ballot. A jurisdiction that wants to do more, the first question is, do we want to do more? Do we want to require people to pull a piece of paper out of their pocket or their pocketbook to prove they are who they say they are and they live where they live? The second question is, who will be required to show ID? In some states, every voter is required to show ID, but that's not universal. In some states, only new voters are required to show ID. The federal Help America Vote Act requires voters who register to vote by mail and don't provide ID and appear to vote for the first time to show ID. So while some states require everyone to show it, one of the questions you can ask is, well, do we want everyone to show it? And if not, who should? And is that fair both to the people being asked to show it and those not? The next question, and this is the one that's gotten the most attention recently, is what kind of ID should they be required to show? Really until the middle of the decade of the 2000s, ID tended to be a document of some kind, a voter card, a utility bill, something else which had name and address on it. Recently, though, we've seen that expanded or in some ways narrowed to include photo IDs, and not just any photo ID, you know, not your Costco club card, which has your picture on it, but a government-issued ID. So not only are we asking people to show ID, not only are we asking every voter to show ID, but we're asking them to have one of a very short list of IDs, and that's the focus of the debate across the country right now. The debate about voter ID has changed significantly in recent years, mostly with the increase in states wanting to require photo ID for voters at the polls. Many states which were already requiring some kind of voter ID are now looking at requiring photo ID at the polls. And that issue has sparked a debate not just about whether or not people should be required to show those IDs, but if they don't have those IDs, what's necessary to get them. And so you are seeing debates in states about if we're going to require ID, are we willing to spend state funds to make sure that people who don't have IDs can get them. And so in some ways, the debate in recent years has changed from should people be required to show ID to should they be required to show photo ID, and to what lengths are states willing to go to make sure they get them. The amendment that's going to be on the November 2012 ballot in Minnesota asks Minnesota voters if they want to amend the state constitution to allow the state to require a photo ID at the polls. The amendment is necessary because the sense is that Minnesota's constitution, like some other state constitutions across the country, absent that amendment, would prohibit the state from acquiring photo ID from voters at the polls. We've seen efforts in other states to get amendments similar to the one on the Minnesota ballot enacted in those states, both because policymakers want to be required, policymakers want to require voters to show voter ID, but also they want to be able to do so without the threat of a state constitutional challenge to such plans. Voter ID nationally, and especially the amendment here in Minnesota, really is driven by competing fears. On one side, you have people who fear the specter of voter fraud, who believe that absent photo ID, that ineligible voters will be able to cast ballots, and in so doing will somehow dilute the votes and weaken the voting rights of people who are otherwise eligible to cast a ballot. On the other side, you have a fear that requiring photo ID will disenfranchise otherwise eligible voters. The fear is that there are people out there who are eligible to vote, who are registered to vote, who want to vote, who, but for the lack of a required photo ID, would be able to cast a ballot. And so in many ways, the heat and the passion of the voter ID debate, not just here in Minnesota, but across the country, is driven by those competing fears. When you listen to opponents of voter ID across the country, not just here in Minnesota, but really everywhere, you hear concern that requiring photo ID to vote will disenfranchise certain populations. One of those are older voters. Older voters often stop driving, relinquish their driver's licenses, don't necessarily have the need for state-issued ID. And the fear is that these voters, which research shows tend to be some of our most reliable voters across the country, would, lacking that ID, might be disenfranchised at the polls. Another group that you hear a lot about and which is driving the debate not just in Minnesota but across the border in Wisconsin and elsewhere are younger voters, in particular students. You get voters who are studying in a college town who may be from somewhere else and might still have a driver's license from their home state, but believe that they are properly domiciled and want to vote in their college town. And the fight is about whether or not they've got some kind of ID, whether it's a student card or some other state ID card, which will enable them to cast a ballot. The fear is that absent provisions to make sure that those students can get qualifying ID, that they will be disenfranchised at the polls.
Yeah, boy, it's really big, isn't it? It's really. Um, do you feel that is the debate around voter ID, can you talk about, is there a relationship between the debate around voter ID and partisanship?
I think one of the reasons why the voter ID debate across the country has become so fierce is that it tracks very neatly the partisan divide in this country. Republicans, by and large, support voter ID. They are concerned about fraud. They are concerned about the integrity of the process, and they see photo ID as not just a useful but a necessary tool to prevent fraud at the polls. Democrats, on the other hand, tend to focus more on individual voters and the franchise, and they see voter ID as a tool that would disenfranchise voters, and they are concerned that requiring ID would shut out otherwise eligible voters from the process. Stir in the fact that both sides seem to believe that a tiny number of votes can affect outcomes at just about every level of elections, and you have the recipe for a pretty white-hot debate across the country. One thing about voter ID that I think gets lost a little bit in the debate is how the differences between the parties are more than just self-interest at election time. I think it's important to note that in some ways voter ID strikes at a very fundamental policy difference between the parties. I think too often in the media and in some of the debate, you hear allegations that one or the other side either favors or opposes ID because it will help them on election day. I think the important thing is to focus on really how ID neatly tracks the policy differences between the parties. So, for example, rather than assume that someone supports voter ID because they're a Republican, I think it's more that they are Republican because they support voter ID. If the next person to walk through the door, if I told you that they opposed voter ID and had concerns about disenfranchising eligible voters, you would guess with a pretty high certainty that that person is a Democrat. And while I don't deny that there is some politics in the debate, I think it's important to remember that there's a real fundamental policy divide, which isn't going to go away just because ID is either enacted or defeated in a given state.